Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, as today we begin to discuss Unit 4, Day 3. Let's talk about transport, baby. Let's talk about transport. Let's talk about diffusion and active transport. Let's go. Let's talk about transport.
All right, so this is Unit 4, Day 3, and today we're talking all about diffusion. All right, so today's aim is how do molecules move across a cell membrane in passive transport? And passive means that it does not require any energy, and another way to say passive transport is diffusion, right? So passive transport is diffusion. Those words mean the same thing. Diffusion. All right. So let's go ahead and continue. Oops, skipping a little ahead there. All right. All right, so how do molecules move across a cell membrane in passive transport? And we remember that with passive transport, guys, we are just talking about diffusion. So a substance is most likely to diffuse into a cell when it is a large organic food molecule, such as protein or starch. So diffusion happens without the use of any energy. These are materials that can pass directly through the cell membrane, and they are allowed to get through, or able to get through rather, due to the selectively permeable quality of the cell membrane. It is enclosed in an organelle, such as a vacuole, so it's not going to be able to diffuse if it's enclosed in an organelle. The concentration of the substance is greater outside the cell than inside, where the pH of the substance is greater than the pH of the cell. So hopefully you know that number 3 is the answer, because objects and materials diffuse down the concentration gradient or along the concentration gradient from high concentration to low concentration. And we're going to look more at that today. Second question, so the answer is 3. The second question, does passive transport require energy? Why or why not? No, passive transport does not require energy. Passive transport is diffusion, which does not require energy and happens as a sort of natural consequence of this concentration gradient. All right, so Unit 4, Day 3 notes, simple diffusion. Simple diffusion, so basic diffusion, involves small nonpolar molecules like carbon dioxide or oxygen that can pass directly through the lipid bilayer, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and some hormones. Simple diffusion requires no energy. No energy. This is in your notes. The words in red are in your notes. Molecules move from an area of high to low concentration. An example of simple diffusion is the diffusion of oxygen into blood cells going into the lungs. So this is some of the most important diffusion that happens in our bodies. So I just inhaled oxygen, and in that quick second that I inhaled oxygen, the oxygen was able to diffuse through the cell membrane of my alveoli in my lungs. The oxygen was able to get into my bloodstream when I inhaled, and in that same moment that the oxygen was able to diffuse directly into my bloodstream, carbon dioxide was able to diffuse out of my bloodstream into my alveoli to be exchanged for that oxygen that I inhaled to exhale that carbon dioxide. So that diffusion is happening constantly all the time. And it's very important that it happens without the use of energy, because if we needed energy to do that, that would mean that we would expend a tremendous amount of energy just trying to breathe, right? That wouldn't be good for our survival. So diffusion of oxygen into blood cells going into the lungs is an example of simple diffusion. And there's another example. So simple diffusion requires no energy. Molecules move from high to low concentration, and it looks a little something like that, right? So at the end of diffusion, the molecules would be evenly distributed. So like in the beginning, oh, it played, but in the beginning they were all here in the corner, right? And then they distribute over time. And that is something that diffusion does require, is time. All right. Diffusion is a passive process, which means no energy is used to make the molecules move. So you can see there was a higher concentration outside of the cell than in. So then the molecules started to move into the cell. Oxygen molecules can pass into the cell that way via diffusion. So we can see here, this is the cell membrane, and there's a high concentration of solute outside of the cell. So let's say that's oxygen, right? There's a high concentration of oxygen in this room. When I inhale, it's that oxygen that's going to diffuse its way into my lungs, because inside of my lungs, there's a high concentration of carbon dioxide waiting to be exhaled, right? That all of my cells produced as a byproduct of cellular respiration, that carbon dioxide, that gradient imbalance, inside my body, there's a lot of carbon dioxide, outside of my body, there's a lot of oxygen, is what directs that diffusion from happening. And that movement of carbon dioxide and oxygen is what keeps not just humans, but most living animals alive. And it also is obviously deeply related to what we just discussed in Unit 3. And you can see sort of how the story of living environment is starting to tell itself through our units. So outside of the cell, and we can even think of this in non-living examples, okay? So let's say you're mixing up some chocolate milk. All right, so you take the chocolate powder and you take a big heaping spoonful of the chocolate powder and it lands at the bottom of your cup, right? So you take the chocolate powder and you put it in the bottom of your cup, and then you have a high concentration of chocolate powder at the bottom of your cup, right? Now, because milk is like slightly fatty, chocolate milk doesn't mix usually as quickly as, let's say, Kool-Aid does, right? So you have to add a little energy in to make the process occur, right? But that aside, okay, the analogy still works, right? Because as you add the energy to stir, facilitate that diffusion, what starts to happen is at the bottom of your glass, you might at first have a dark chocolate color, but then it distributes throughout the liquid and you get a sort of homogeneous, like light brown color that is your chocolate milk, as opposed to maybe that dark chocolate color that is in a high concentration. All of a sudden now it distributes itself evenly throughout the glass of milk. And if you left a glass of milk to sit with chocolate powder in the bottom for a few hours, over time, diffusion without energy would occur. It would just take more time. And in the same way, if you left a glass of Kool-Aid, for example, over time, it would become Kool-Aid. The way that you speed up that process is, again, by adding that energy of your hand to stir the mixture. So the solute in every case moves down the concentration gradient. The solute always moves from high to low concentration. So they're all ganged up with their buddies, and then they spread out to mingle at the party. That's how solutes like to get down. All right, here's your notes for facilitated diffusion. And I do believe this is where I will leave you today. So let's go ahead and get through it. Facilitated diffusion. Many ions in polar molecules are important for cell function and do not diffuse easily through the nonpolar lipid bilayer. During facilitated diffusion, transport proteins help these substances diffuse through the cell membrane. Glucose or amino acids. This requires no energy, and transport proteins move from high to low concentration. An example is how glucose or amino acids move from blood into a cell. And we're going to talk more about the facilitated diffusion of glucose when we get to Unit 5 and talk about insulin and the pancreas. So right now what you need to know is that facilitated diffusion happens from high to low concentration, same way as regular diffusion. It still requires no energy, but it involves the transportation of materials that may not be able to pass easily through the nonpolar lipid bilayer. Facilitated diffusion doesn't require energy. It uses transport proteins to move from high to low concentration. And an example is glucose or amino acids moving from the blood into the cell. All right, and nope, just kidding. There's one more part to your notes today, and that's osmosis. Osmosis is a type of passive transport that is important to keeping cells functional. Osmosis allows cells to maintain water balance. So osmosis is the diffusion of water. And the diffusion of water is so important that there's a word to describe it, and that is osmosis. So osmosis is the diffusion of water across a membrane. Osmosis, just like regular diffusion, happens down the concentration gradient from high water concentration or water potential to low water concentration or water potential. Osmosis is the diffusion of water across a membrane, and it moves from high water potential to low water potential. And that can also, as you can see here, be said in the reverse way. So if you have a high concentration of water, it means you have very pure water. It means you have almost no solutes in your water, compared to if you have a low concentration of water. For example, salt water, seawater, may have a low water potential compared to fresh water because it's filled with salt. It's filled with solute. So if we had a cell and on one side there was seawater and on the other side there was fresh water, the water from the freshwater side might move out of the cell and dehydrate the cell because it's trying to, in its own way, hydrate that external environment. It's trying to move from a high concentration of water to a low concentration of water because that's just how diffusion works. It requires no energy, and it's kind of just like a natural consequence of being alive. You can sort of think of diffusion almost like inertia. Diffusion is going to happen whether we want it to or not. It is the natural state of molecules, a little bit like entropy. All right, and we are going to do a lab that demonstrates this principle, but as you can see, from a high water potential or low solute concentration to the low H2O potential or high solute concentration. So this would be the fresh water on this side. This is the seawater through the cell membrane. This fresh water is being pushed out into the seawater. And all right, that is all I have for you today. The last question you are answering is, using the diagram above, describe how water moves during osmosis, which I just spent a few minutes talking about, so hopefully you can explain that water during osmosis moves from areas of high water potential to areas of low water potential, the same way solutes would move during diffusion. All right, or gases or oxygen, take your pick there. But all right, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I have for you today. Please don't forget to complete your exit ticket, submit your guided notes, and I'll see you all tomorrow on Zoom. Bye, guys.